All right, can everyone hear me? In the back, can you guys hear me? All right, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to this session where we're going to be talking about the HTML support in Apollo. So my name is Christopher Brichford. I'm a senior computer scientist on the Apollo team. I work in San Jose for Adobe. I've been working on Apollo since about, I think, October or November of 2004, which is actually before the deal closed. Oh, it says I can't say that. Oh, 2005, sorry. Sorry, 2005, which is before the deal closed. We actually started working on it a little bit before the deal closed. And I've been at Adobe for about a total of like 5.5, 6 years at this point. So today's presentation, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Apollo, talk a little bit about why we're supporting HTML in Apollo, give you a description of that HTML, of what we're going to be doing to support HTML Apollo. I'll talk about which HTML engine we're using. I'm sure a lot of you would like to talk about that. And I'll give you a little bit of the overview of the API for how you'll be able to interact with HTML in Apollo and what you'll be able to do from JavaScript in Apollo. And of course, throughout the presentation, I'll have some demos. And I'm going to assume that you have some idea of Apollo. I will give a brief overview of Apollo, but hopefully you've heard something about Apollo at this point. And I'm also assuming that you have some knowledge with HTML or Flash, and you sort of know what those things are and a little bit about how you can use them. So Apollo is a runtime that runs on multiple different platforms and potentially one day different types of devices like set-top boxes and stuff like that. It allows you to create desktop applications or desktop rich internet applications using web technology. So you can use HTML, Flash, JavaScript, and ActionScript, and PDF to create the user experience for these applications, and you can write the logic in JavaScript or ActionScript. What this means is that you can reuse existing assets that you already have. If you already have HTML for your web applications, you already have Flash content for those applications, and you can reuse those assets as is to create Apollo applications. You can also reuse the tools and the workflows that you're using to create those assets. We're not expecting to change the way you interact with your designers. Adobe might, via other products, improve those workflows like we saw at the keynote, but Apollo isn't going to be driving changes in your workflows unless you want it to. You can continue to work the way you work today. And an Apollo application can be pure Flash or pure HTML or a mixture of both. And the Apollo runtime, of course, will be a free download. So anyone can it's freely available to anyone on Mac, Windows, and Linux, and they'll be able to download it and install it just like they can with the Flash player today. And Adobe will use a number of strategies to try and drive adoption. But the number one way we hope to drive adoption is by having great applications that run on Apollo that make people want to download the Apollo runtime. And of course, there will be free tools to create Apollo applications. You will not have to pay Adobe any money to create an Apollo application. That's especially true for Apollo applications that use HTML. You'll be able to write your HTML in Notepad or Emacs just like you do today. You have to write an application XML file, which is a little bit of metadata, and you package that up in an air file, which is basically a zip file, and post that on your website, and you have an Apollo application. So now I'm going to show you a demo of a little application that I created to test the HTML functionality as I was getting it working. It's called the HTML control test. Of course, this is the regular installer for an Apollo application. We're going to go ahead and install this application, and we're going to run it when we're finished. And some of you might have seen this yesterday at Brent and Ethan's talk. This morning, luckily, I had some time to improve on it so I could show you something new. So I'm going to go to Google here. Okay. I'm going to open another tab, and I'm going to go to Slashdot.
Nice.
Oh, we haven't been Slashdotted yet. Hopefully that'll change. All right, you can adjust the alpha transparency of the window, and you can see the Flash content behind the HTML control showing through. The links still work. You can see they highlight and stuff like that. Let's try to take my life in my hands and click on the link there. You can scale it down. Oops. You can rotate it. The links still work when it's rotated. You can blur it You have the drunk browser there if you had too much to drink last night. Go back to Google. I'm going to blur Google. Well, actually, we can't blur it yet. I'm going to type some text in here. I'm going to blur it, and then I'm going to hit the submit button. So there's all sorts of fun things you can do with that. So this is the sort of thing that we're envisioning that you'll be able to do with Apollo's HTML support. Basically, we have total control over how the rendering looks. You'll be able to blur it, do all the flash effects that you can do. And I'll explain a little bit later how that's sort of going to work. What? Rotate it what? Oh, okay. Ed wants me to do rotate type. Unblur it here. Of course, you can still type in here while it's rotated. And of course, hit the submit button. So, pretty cool stuff. Oops. All right, so why are we supporting HTML and Apollo? Well, we really want to be able to help you reuse existing content. There's probably more HTML than there is Flash or PDF. And so we want to be able to reuse that content to create these desktop experiences. And we also want to be able to reuse the services and the logic that HTML is interacting with. There's Ajax is happening. You see Google Maps and stuff like that, these Ajax applications. And we want to create a path for those applications to migrate to the desktop. So maybe you can use some of those Ajax applications when you're offline, or you can just use them without the browser Chrome. We also want to leverage the knowledge that this community is developing around how to do Ajax programming. People are learning new things, and we want to make sure that those new things they're learning will be applicable to Apollo. So by supporting HTML and Apollo, we can make that possible. And we also want to support better text layout in Flash. There is the text field in Flash, and you can put some limited HTML in there, and you can make the text bold with a B tag and stuff like that. But by having this HTML support in Apollo, we can give you the full power of street HTML support. You can do very complex layouts like CNN.com as part of your application UI. So you can have an image, and you can have text flowing around the image and stuff like that. So when we were thinking about HTML support in Apollo, we were sort of thinking about two major categories of things we'd be supporting. One is the embedded browser case, which is basically a full-on web browser control embedded inside of a Flash application or inside of an Apollo application. And one of the reasons you might want to do that is, you have like an MP3 player or something like that, and you have a deal with one of your partners to show some content from theirs to generate revenue, ad revenue or something like that. And you could use an HTML control to show just arbitrary HTML there. You wouldn't have to negotiate with the client to get them to cough up an image or a Flash file. Any regular URL that works in a browser, you could just show the contents of that URL as part of your application. The other thing I think we were envisioning is something like a dashboard application where it's like an intranet web browser. It's basically a web browser that's specific to a particular company. It has toolbars and stuff like that are specific to workflows within a certain company, but it's a really functional web browser, so they have no reason to switch back to Internet Explorer or Firefox. They can just stay in that one browser, yet have all of that added functionality that organization wanted to add. And the other type of use case is HTML as UI. And what this is, basically the text field on steroids. Again, so you can use the power of HTML, CSS, box model layout to construct portions of a user interface in an application, or potentially the entire user interface for an application. And the other thing about HTML as UI is the ability to recycle these Ajax widgets that we're starting to see developed on the internet. You'll be able to recycle those Ajax widgets and include them as part of an Apollo application. So you can use Flex widgets as part of your UI, and you could also use Ajax widgets as part of your UI. In fact, we have a demo later that shows that. So now I'm going to start talking a little bit about more of the details of the Apollo support for HTML. So the HTML engine renders to the Flash display list, and I'm assuming you guys know what the Flash display list. It's the render tree. You can have bitmaps and sprites, and you can draw lines and boxes and stuff like that on the display list. And the display list is what gets rasterized to make the image that you actually see as a result of the Flash player's rendering. And so the HTML engine is rendering to that display list. which is why you can do things like apply effects and rotations and blurs to it. And so in the HTML engine really is a Flash display. It actually inherits from the Flash displayless object ActionScript type. And we're thinking about using Flash fonts to render the HTML text so that text will look the same between in HTML as it does inside of Flash and other parts of the Flex UI. And that basically means using the Saffron text engine to render HTML text, which is, the current builds don't do that, but it's something we're looking at. And we also want to make sure that the HTML form widgets are visually consistent with the Flex widgets, so that a user shouldn't be able to tell what part of your application's UI is in HTML and what part of your application's UI is in Flex or Flash. The other big thing that we're doing in our HTML support is what we call script bridging. And so what this is the ability to have JavaScript and ActionScript code call functions written in the other language and access properties and methods and hold references to objects between that script engine boundary, across that script engine boundary. And this is really powerful. And this would enable you to do things like manipulate the HTML DOM from ActionScript. This also enables you to manipulate the Flash display list from JavaScript inside of an HTML widget. And it also allows you to take a set of logic that you've written in JavaScript. You have a function or classes or objects or whatever, and you can instantiate that functionality from inside of ActionScript and then leverage that functionality without having to rewrite it in ActionScript. So you can sort of decide ahead of time where it makes the best sense to write your application logic, whether it's ActionScript or in JavaScript. And you can just write it in whichever of those languages you want, and Apollo will allow you to call those functions no matter which scripting engine you happen to be in when you want to call those functions. And of course, that mechanism is synchronous, which means that when you invoke a JavaScript function from ActionScript, the ActionScript function will block until the JavaScript function returns, which makes a very simple programming model. You don't have to wait for completion events or anything like that. You can just call. It's just, you know, you can really stop caring whether or not the thing you're calling is in JavaScript or in ActionScript. And it's going to be much more seamless than the external interface functionality that's already in Flash Player 8. And I don't know if you're familiar about that, but I would encourage you to learn about it. But this is much, the main difference between what we're doing in Apollo and what external interface is. External interface, whenever you access an object from JavaScript and HTML that's an ActionScript object, you're actually getting a copy of the object because that object got serialized to XML, sent across the boundary as a string, and then deserialized in the HTML. And a similar sort of thing happens going the other direction. So Apollo is going to allow you to load HTML from the network, just like you can today. You can use HTTP URLs to load your HTML. You can have HTTP URLs in your image source attributes. You can also load HTML from a URL request. So you can construct a flash.net.url request, which is an ActionScript object, add extra headers to it, add post data to it, and then take that URL request and give it to the HTML engine. And it'll go to that URL, it'll execute that URL request, get the HTML back, and start rendering it into the HTML control. You can also load HTML out of an ActionScript string, which is something I forgot to show you. So here, in this text box here, we actually have a body of HTML, and I can click Go, and it will render that HTML. So that means it's pretty powerful because then you can generate your HTML on the fly on the client and have that HTML rendered. And you're also going to be able to access HTML content via a new mechanism, or from a new place, which is the application package. So when an Apollo application is installed, it has a directory structure on the user's computer. And that directory structure can contain assets for your application, like HTML files, PNG files, Swift files, all those sort of files. And you can reference files in that directory structure using a new URL scheme that we're working on called Adobe App. And the main reason for that is having a new scheme rather than just using file colon and stuff like that is Adobe App will pretty much always work no matter what the security situation is, whereas a file colon URL might not work if that application doesn't have sufficient privilege to see the entire disk or something like that. So it's a way of, and it's also sort of more convenient because then you don't have to construct the URL to the installation location of the application and do relative to that. You can just, the Adobe app URL is rooted at the application's directory on the system. So we're also planning to allow arbitrary composition of HTML and Flash. So Flash can contain HTML, HTML containing Flash. You can also have more than one level of nesting. Flash containing HTML containing more Flash containing HTML, and vice versa. The way you compose your application will be entirely up to you as to how you compose it out of HTML and Flash. Of course, when we're doing this, the object models, which is sort of referencing the script bridging stuff, the security model, and the event models will be tightly integrated together, such that the right thing happens when the mouse is clicked and stuff like that. The capture bubble phases will happen through the different content types properly. This also means you can have pure HTML and JavaScript Apollo applications. So you'll have full access to all of the Apollo APIs from JavaScript. In fact, you'll probably even have access to all of the Flash APIs from JavaScript. And you'll have, when you have a pure HTML JavaScript engine, or Apollo application, you'll have full control over how the window looks. So the window doesn't have to have a title bar unless you want it to have a title bar. It won't have back buttons and forward buttons and toolbars and status bars and all that sort of stuff. All right, so I'm going to show you a demo now of something that approximates a pure HTML application. Slight mishap here. There we go. So I've actually unplugged my network cable. And this is the Spry framework that the Dreamweaver team has been working on. And it's a Ajax framework. This is entirely HTML. At least the only part here that's not HTML is actually the window Chrome, the title bar and stuff like that, because I didn't want to have to write that in Ajax, yet I still wanted it to be transparent and fancy looking. It was just easier to do that in Flash. But the rest of the application here is actually a Ajax application. You can see when I mouse over, stuff like, the window, the little icons get bigger and stuff like that. All of that's happening in JavaScript and HTML and CSS. And this is running inside of Apollo. And so you can sort of see the power that you can have because we're using a real HTML engine that renders pretty much any HTML out on the web. I also really encourage you to look at that Spry framework if you are looking at doing Ajax programming. It makes stuff really easy. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about the HTML engine that we chose. So we're using source code from the WebKit open source project. And WebKit is an open source project that Apple started when they started the Safari effort, or when they first released Safari. Now, they started that project based on source code they got from the KDE project, which is the K desktop environment, which is sort of an effort that's got a lot of input from Qt, which is a library that Trolltech owns. And they had a project called KHTML. And WebKit is basically a fork of the KHTML code that Apple is using to develop Safari. And inside of there, they have two sub-projects known as WebCore and JavaScript Core. And we're using the source code from WebCore and JavaScript Core to implement the HTML functionality in Apollo. And so we are sharing a significant amount of source code with Apple that Apple uses in Safari. One of the main reasons that we chose WebKit over the alternatives was Nokia has ported WebKit to the Series 60 phone, which sort of was a proof of concept to us that you could take a very compliant, very capable HTML engine and get it to run on a mid-range phone. The Series 60 phone is by no means the largest, most powerful phone out there. It's a somewhat limited device. And so that holds out the promise to Adobe and to our developer community that we can share an HTML engine between mobile devices and the desktop. We also, when we were looking at WebKit, we were able to understand the source code. It was relatively clear to us what the touch points would have to be for the modifications we need to make WebKit work for Apollo. And we're planning to keep Apollo in sync with Safari's HTML and JavaScript support. You know, my personal goal is that you know, you'll always be able to tell for a given version of Apollo sort of what version of Safari that corresponds to. I can't really sign us up for that right now, but I think that's something to strive for, to make sure that at any given point in time, Apollo is not a new target for your HTML development. You know, the Mac is gaining support, so you know, your web applications, you probably want to start thinking about supporting Safari anyway. And if you support Safari, you shouldn't have to do any additional work to get it to work, to get that HTML to work inside of Apollo. Now, having said all that, the Apollo runtime has a captive version of WebKit. What that means is we have our own copy of WebKit as part of the Apollo runtime. So on Mac, we're not literally sharing the same framework that Apple's using. We compile it ourselves, we build it into our own framework and use it separately. And there's several reasons we do that. Like, one of them is the fact that you'll be able to have multiple versions of the Apollo runtime installed at the same time on the system, and each one of those different versions of Apollo runtime may actually have a slightly different version of WebKit in it. And your application can target, basically say which version of the runtime it runs against, and it will always run against that version of the runtime, even if a newer version is installed. And what that allows you to do is to write your application, test it against a particular Apollo runtime, and when we release the new version of Apollo, you don't then immediately have to test your application against the new runtime. You can basically, you know, qualify your application against one runtime once, and it'll, you know, you don't have to re-qualify it every time we ship a new runtime. And the other thing I want to tell you is that we will be contributing code back to the WebKit project. I mean, now that we have selected WebKit, and for as long as we are using WebKit, we have an interest in making sure it is the most capable HTML engine out there, such that all AJAX applications that we can come across will work with it. And we'll be working with Apple and others in the WebKit developer community to make WebKit even better than it is today. So, HTML plugins. A lot of people have been asking what HTML plugins will we be supporting in Apollo. We'll be supporting PDF. If Acrobat Reader is installed on the system, we'll be leveraging that installation to implement PDF viewing capabilities and the capabilities around, you know, talking to PDF files and communicating with JavaScript running in PDF files, and to print them and to, you know, basically navigate and show them, stuff like that. We'll, of course, also be supporting Flash. Now, Flash can always be rendered in HTML using the Flash player that's part of the Apollo runtime. And for Apollo 1.0, that's going to be based on the Flash Player 9 code base. So that means you'll be able to do Flash Player 9 things in Apollo 1.0 forever, as long as Apollo 1.0 runs. But if you were writing a web browser on top of Apollo, which is something we think is entirely possible, you could imagine that you come across some HTML content, you know, 5, 10 years from now, that requires a newer version of the Flash player than Apollo 1.0 currently has. You know, say that you come across some HTML content that needs Flash Player 10. So we're planning on allowing the HTML engine to load what I call the system Flash player, which is a Flash player that's installed in one of the other browsers or just, you know, somewhere on the system. The details of this we still have to sort out. But the idea is that basically Apollo 1.0 will be able to load future versions of the Flash player, such that when the HTML engine in Apollo 1.0 comes across Flash content on the web that requires a newer version of the Flash player, that content will work correctly. At this time, we're not planning on supporting any other plugins. And our main thinking around this is that we want to have a consistent experience on all the platforms and devices that Apollo supports. And there are very few other plugins that work on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And there are also a few other plugins that really fit into the compositing model the way we'd want it to, such that the blurs and the rotates and all that sort of stuff could be applied to those plugins, or to the rendering of those plugins. So for now, we're planning on limiting it to PDF and Flash. All right, so now I'm going to start talking a little bit about the HTML API. And my main goal here is to give you a feel for how that API is going to look. It's a little shallow on the details right now because we're still working on it and it's still very early. So there's a new ActionScript class, which is in the flash.html package. It's called the HTML control for now. The Flex team would like to rename it the HTML field, so that might happen. It's a subclass of sprites, and of course sprites via some number of intermediate stops of the subclass of display object. Is there interference? Okay. So that means you can add it to the display list just like you can any other display list object. The default behavior of the HTML control is based on iframe. So when you click on a link, it will actually navigate the HTML control to whatever that link points at. Stuff like that. There might be some scroll bars built in, such as the content's too large. The user can scroll around to see it all. But there won't be any browser Chrome there, no back button, no forward button, no status bar, no URL box. It's just sort of like a rectangle of HTML sitting on the screen. So here's some sample code to add HTML to Flash. You can see you instantiate a new HTML control. You can set its height and width to whatever you want. You can add it as a child to the display list. And then you can load from a URL request and have it load adobe.com or any other URL you want. And since this is a URL request, you can add extra request headers. You can set cookies. You can have host data and all that sort of stuff. And you can point it at any URL that URL request can talk to. And then the other thing we're going to allow you to do is to access the window object of the contained HTML as a property on the HTML control. Now, if you're not familiar with HTML, the window object in HTML is basically a global object. All global variables and all functions defined at the outer scope are properties of the window object. So by giving you access to the window object of the HTML contained by the HTML control, we're basically giving you full access to the JavaScript object model. Because as properties on the ActionScript version of the window object, that object will contain properties that correspond to all the functions and all the global variables from the JavaScript running inside of that HTML control. So you can customize the behavior of the HTML control by subclassing it. And so when you subclass the HTML control, you can do things like control what happens when a link is clicked on. Because you could imagine that you have some HTML rendered in your application, and when the user clicks on a link, you don't want it to navigate that HTML control. You always want that link to open in a new window because that HTML is sort of part of your UI. It just doesn't make sense in that context to have that link cause that thing to navigate, cause that HTML control to navigate. So you can subclass the HTML control, override a method on it, and in that method you can have it create a new Apollo window. You can then instantiate an HTML control inside of there and point that HTML control at the URL that the link was pointing at. You can also do things like control what happens when window.open is called. And the reason you might want to do that is because when you're opening a window, well, the JavaScript can ask for things like the toolbar and the status bar and the URL box. Well, the Apollo runtime in and of itself won't know how to render those things, and it certainly won't know how to render them the way you want them rendered. So by overriding the functionality of this window.open, you can create the Apollo window, instantiate Flash content or other HTML content if necessary to implement the toolbars and the URL box and stuff like that. And of course, there's many other things you'll be able to control, such as controlling what happens when a form is submitted and stuff like that. So again, by default, the HTML control though will behave like an iframe, except that it can be hosted by Flash content. And the Flex framework will be providing interesting subclasses of the HTML control. You could imagine that the Flex team has a subclass of the HTML control and furthermore a Flex component, a UI component that basically is a browser. It could have the back buttons and stuff like that baked in. So you're not necessarily going to have to do the work of subclassing the HTML control yourself. We expect that there'll be Adobe frameworks and third-party frameworks that will help you create your HTML UI the way you want. So now I'll talk about HTML Apollo applications. So this is where HTML is either the entire application UI or is the root of the application's UI. So it'll be rendered in a window with no browser Chrome. Because again, Apollo doesn't know how to render back buttons. Those have to be defined by the application content because we don't want to dictate to you what a back button looks like or what a back button does for that matter. And so you'll get a window with no toolbar, no status bar, no location bar, none of the browser Chrome. You just get a window, it draws the HTML in the window, similar to the example I showed with the Spry gallery. The one thing I am thinking though is that we probably would put in scroll bars to make sure that the user can get to all the contents there, and you can avoid having those scroll bars show up by just making sure that the window is the correct size. But the entire application UI would need to be rendered in HTML and Flash. That's, the one exception is there is a window mode in Apollo where you can get a title bar and a close button, a minimize button, and a maximize button. But other than that, the entire contents of that window has to be rendered by the content that is your application. And the JavaScript APIs will behave exactly as they do in the browser. So what can you do in JavaScript inside of Apollo? So you'll be able to invoke any Flash or Apollo API. So that means you can use JavaScript to call the Apollo file system APIs that Stan is talking about tomorrow. You can also use JavaScript to manipulate the Flash display list. However, this does not mean that you can take a Flash display object and add it to a child of a div. Div's children must be other DOM nodes. So just because you can use JavaScript to instantiate another display list object doesn't mean that you can just add it to things where it doesn't make sense. You'll still get runtime exceptions and stuff like that. And we're also not entirely sure where the Apollo APIs will be exposed in the JavaScript object model. One idea I had right now is like, well, maybe there's an Adobe object that's a property of the window object. And again, the window object is a global object. So if you're in JavaScript, you would, instead of having to say window.adobe, you would just be able to say adobe.flash.net.url stream. In fact, you could say new adobe.flash.net.url stream to construct a new URL stream. And that's pretty powerful, because the URL stream allows you to download bytes from just about any URL on the internet, subject to security constraints. And you can actually read the bytes, whereas today in HTML, you can really only load XML using XML HT requests. There's no way of loading bytes off a URL unless the server has encapsulated that in a CData section or something like that. All right, so I have a demo here of an application that uses both HTML and Flash called Maptacular. It's actually in the keynote.
Can give me this cable.
I wish. Okay, connect again. So there's Google Maps. We all know and love it. And drag my work on there. So we have drag and drop support between the Flash and the HTML content. And you can see there is Adobe's San Jose office. Fortunately, with the small window size. Okay. You can see the satellite pictures work. You can zoom in. You can drag around in here. Pretty responsive. And you can pin this thing. So drag work, and let's see, maybe I want to figure out how to get to Christian's house. And I can do that as well. And you can see Christian's picture. So in this in this image here, you can in this demo here, you can see that there's HTML that's on top of the window background. It's basically the lowest thing. But then you can have Flash content that's overlaying that. And because this content here on the side is not entirely opaque, you can actually see the HTML showing through. And that's taking advantage of the fact that we really are rendering to the Flash display list and sort of showing it in a more useful way than blurring it or rotating it. So I think that's shows you the power of sort of this integration that will allow you to create really great experiences using HTML. So there's two things I really want you to take away, and I want you to tell all your friends about. All right, so there's only two things to remember for this entire talk. These are the two things. And that's that we're unifying the HTML and Flash rendering pipeline so that the HTML can be anywhere on the Flash display as you want. You can have Flash underneath it, you can have Flash on top of it, you can apply the bitmap effects to it, you can rotate it, you can blur it, you can do all that stuff to it. It's just like any other bit of Flash content. And the fact that we're bridging the JavaScript and the ActionScript object models so that you can use JavaScript to manipulate ActionScript objects, and you can use ActionScript to manipulate JavaScript objects, and those are live objects, they're not copies. You're getting real references across that script engine boundary. So those are the two main things I really want you to take away, because I think they're some of the most interesting features about Apollo. I'm just finishing up now, so I was going to tell you about some other Apollo sessions that you might be interested in. There's another version of this talk today at 3 p.m., and there's the Advanced Apollo Application Development tomorrow at 12:30, and the File API at 1:45, and Mike Chambers has a Getting Started with Apollo session at 3 p.m. tomorrow. And for more information about Apollo, including the HTML support, you can go to adobe.com/goapollo. There's information and links there to how to sign up for the public beta and all that sort of stuff. And with that, I can open it up to questions.
Drag and drop, is it an Apollo drag and drop or it's a Windows drag and drop?
It's like you were showing me stuff.
So the question was, do we access embedded fonts? I assume you mean fonts embedded in the Flash from HTML. That is not something that is in the current builds, but it is something that we're looking at. And that's sort of what I was alluding to a little bit with supporting like saffron fonts and stuff like that in HTML text. Yes?
So with the Lincoln engine now supporting SVG, will there be interoperability between Flash content, SVG content, and HTML and vice versa?
So the question is now that WebKit is supporting SVG, are we planning on, well, I guess the first question would be, are we planning on supporting SVG in Apollo? And if so, like, can you communicate between SVG and HTML and ActionScript? And so the answer is we're looking at that, but I think the direction we're heading right now is we'd like SVG to get a little bit more mature, especially that implementation. And I think we might let that ship in Safari for a version or two before we pick that up. I think that would be true of any WebKit technology, including MapML and some of the other strange stuff that might be in there.
I was told that JavaScript is not to PDF.
In the browser or in